Hey everybody, and welcome to the 5 Bytes podcast. I'm your host, Rory Monahan. Coming up on this week's episode, Google has pumped the brakes on their efforts to kill third-party cookies. Also, Omnissa makes its first big announcement since VMware divested its EUC division. And, of course, I will do a pretty deep dive into the catastrophic outage that occurred last week after an erroneous CrowdStrike content update. For this and more, keep listening to this episode of the podcast, which of course, as always, is brought to you by my sponsors. And that includes ControlUp, end-to-end digital experience management for the work from anywhere era. ControlUp, happy users, happy IT. And also brought to you by Network's Policy Pack, where you use Group Policy Pack Cloud, or MDM, to remove local admin rights, manage and lock down applications, Java, browsers, and mitigate ransomware, plus more. And also brought to you by Numescent, the inventors of the first and only cloud-native container management platform for Windows desktops. And of course, also brought to you by Master Packager, who make an application packaging software that helps you build packages that end users love, enterprises want, and the Windows OS needs. If you enjoy the show each week, you have these awesome sponsors to thank. And now for some news. Of course, the first story I have to cover in this week's episode is the massive catastrophic outage caused last Friday by an erroneous content update by CrowdStrike. If you listen to this podcast regularly, you're probably already familiar with CrowdStrike, but for those who are not, they are a cybersecurity company who makes several security products, including a very popular endpoint security product. This endpoint security product is able to leverage AI to, on the fly, basically teach itself to better protect endpoints against new threats. CrowdStrike boasts 298 customers out of the Fortune 500, 43 out of 50 US states, and 8 of the top 10 food and beverage, auto, financial services, and tech companies, according to a report by The Register. Regarding the actual outage, at around 4:09 a.m. UTC time on Friday, some Windows machines with CrowdStrike's Falcon sensor product began to experience blue screens of death. A content update was pushed to all Windows machines running the product by CrowdStrike, meaning if you ran the software and your machine was on the network in a powered-on state, you would have received that content update at some point around that time. There were several theories being bandied about as to what the content update did to cause the crashes, including a theory about an attempt made to read from a memory address that was null. So the old classic programming error of a null pointer. The null pointer theory was debunked by others, and for their part, CrowdStrike provided some information, but honestly not a whole lot. But in their status update, they stated the content update was to channel file 291, which they stated controls how Falcon evaluates named pipe execution on Windows systems, explaining named pipes are used for normal inter-process or inter-system communication in Windows. The update that occurred at 4:09 a.m. UTC was designed to target newly observed malicious named pipes being used by common C2 frameworks in cyber attacks, so those command server type cyber attacks. The configuration update triggered a logic error that resulted in an operating crash. The error that people started report seeing was a blue screen of death error that highlighted a csagent.sys driver as the culprit, which you know, .sys or sys, you think that's a kernel driver. But it has been stated that it was not a kernel driver, but was a file required for operations at the kernel level, and they gave it a .sys extension. Due to the timing of the content update being made available, the first to be majorly impacted in the height of their business hours was Australia. Although the content update went out while those of us in Europe and most in the US were asleep, it didn't spare any country really, because always-on machines such as kiosks received the update and bricked overnight. While the content update was reportedly made available at 4:09 a.m. UTC time and pulled back by 5:27 a.m. UTC time, it seems many machines that were online got rocked. And it was quite a few machines too. Microsoft has said 8.5 million Windows machines were affected. And this was indiscriminate too by the sounds of things. Physical Windows desktops, virtual Windows desktops, all got bodied by this. CrowdStrike CEO George Kurtz was on a US morning chat show on Friday and said it impacted certain Windows machines on certain patch levels, but I've yet to see a breakdown of what patch levels specifically were affected. Of those 8.5 million machines were devices used by airlines, kiosks such as screens in airports for displaying flights, desktops in hospitals, banks, television stations or networks were taken down, and pretty much every industry felt the wrath of this outage. It caused absolute chaos, with an example being over 1,000 flights were canceled just Friday morning alone, and even on Saturday morning there were still 600 flights canceled in the US. Reports suggested that Delta Airlines were the worst affected of all the airlines, with claims that 100% of their flights in Atlanta were canceled at the height of the issue. Those stuck in a blue screen of death loop were told that they could recover the desktops, but it was a very manual, time-consuming process. They would have to boot into safe mode or the Windows recovery environment, go to the C Windows System 32 drivers CrowdStrike directory, and delete any file matching C-000000291 and .sys. So there could be several of those files with that prefix with that C long numerical value, as long as that numerical value was 291. If those files were deleted and then a reboot was completed, the reboot should happen successfully and the machine should be recovered. This was quite a task to complete, however, especially for physical machines such as those in those airports. Like those displays tend to be elevated and connected through a patch cable coming down from the roof. So there were some videos and pictures shared of people in airports showing technicians climbing ladders to get to those endpoints. There were some other fixes pointed out by those experiencing the issue and people in the community, such as rebooting the affected machines just a bunch of times. I saw Erik from zenappblog.com said that he could recover machines after about 7 reboots, and I saw several others saying that their desktops were recovered after 14 to 15 reboots. So the reason being that if the desktop rebooted and was able to make a connection and then get the fix or the update from CrowdStrike before it got a chance to crash or get to a recovery screen, the fix would be implemented quick enough that the desktops would then be able to reboot. Jeremy Moskowitz from Show Sponsor Network's Policy Pack shared a couple of videos that he created with different ways you could have leveraged group policy preferences to help, and also explained in more detail why multiple reboots may have helped those facing this CrowdStrike issue. With Jeremy's solution, you could fix machines pretty easily and with only 1 to 2 reboots required. He explained using his group policy method could work faster than the CrowdStrike service because that fix could be processed before the CrowdStrike service actually initiated on the endpoints. Dave Plummer, who's a former Windows developer, also shared his opinion on the issue with a great 13-minute long video that I suggest you check out because he gave other great insight just generally around kernel drivers in Windows. He also provided some responses to some of the questions or topics that people were raising on social media during the incident, like why doesn't Windows just disable a driver automatically if it detects a problem? Some others in the community also contributed some clever fixes using bootable recovery media with an embedded fix. It seemed the worst affected were those who used encryption solutions like Bitlocker, as recovery attempts triggered a prompt for Bitlocker recovery keys, which could require retrieving the recovery keys from AD or Enter ID and then entering them in manually, which sucks because the keys are really long. Microsoft did share their own automated fix for those with Bitlocker in the mix, which unfortunately was only partially automated as it required extracting the recovery keys and putting those on a USB key along with the automated recovery media and booting the affected devices with that solution. Presumably, some of the fixes may have depended on the state of your entire infrastructure, because if your domain controllers were also screwed, you probably had to recover those first. but at least those are likely to be central. You'd be able to get at those, and they're probably virtual machines for the most part, so it may have been easier to recover those. And there's not that many domain controllers versus the number of desktops in your organization anyway, so getting those up first and then implementing a fix was what would make sense. Now, if you maybe had only used MBAM and did a sync of the recovery keys, and you unfortunately decided to use BitLocker encryption on your domain controllers, which I hope nobody did, well then, you were in a particularly tough spot. But, MBAM, I don't know if it's even supported anymore. I think most are syncing them to Entra, so hopefully they're in Entra and you're able to recover. There were others in the community who said it was possible to run a script to make the change without entering the recovery key or going into safe mode by way of multiple reboots, saying eventually it could work if the machine happened to make that connection before BitLocker got to the point of prompting for recovery or Windows got to the point of detecting it needed that crash. And just before I recorded this episode, there was talk on the sysadmin subreddit on Reddit that CrowdStrike themselves have shared a fix from their cloud console that removes the need for jumping through hoops and hoping for a connection. It does this by quarantining the file that people have been attempting to delete as part of the manual recovery process. As CrowdStrike runs so early in the boot process, it does have a high chance of doing this before the machine has a chance to lock up or crash. Reportedly, it is best for the devices to have a wired connection, and 2 to 3 reboots may still be required. Unfortunately, this is an opt-in option, and apparently it can take an hour plus for it to become available for you in your organization. So it actually kind of sounds a little bit like what Jeremy was saying, where CrowdStrike does get processed pretty early in the Windows boot up process, so it would be able to hopefully get in before a crash is detected or before the recovery is detected. But it also sounds like Jeremy was saying that the group policy processing also happens early, so you're kind of meeting at both ends there because they're very similar solution-wise. Only CrowdStrike is going to quarantine those files to allow the boot versus what Jeremy was doing, which was implementing what was the recommended fix, but doing it via group policy. In the fallout of this issue, Microsoft started catching strays due to the crashing. My father and my cousin both messaged me asking what was going on with Microsoft. Some mainstream media outlets like Sky and BBC were pretty lazy in their early reporting and just called it a Microsoft outage. Even though 8.5 million machines seems like a big number, Microsoft stated it was only about 1% of all Windows machines. The fact of the matter is, it was not a Microsoft outage. Only Windows machines with CrowdStrike products faced the issue, so I could see why some would call it a Microsoft outage. I mean, those with CrowdStrike on Linux and Mac OS at the time were not facing the same problem. So you go, oh, well, the common denominator here is Microsoft. But that was not the case. It was an issue created by CrowdStrike, not Microsoft. The reporting seemed to make non-techie people worried that turning on their own PC may result in their PC crashing and becoming unusable, because they didn't even realize that CrowdStrike was the major component. They just thought it was a Microsoft issue, and therefore if they had Windows, if they booted up their powered off machine, maybe it would get the problem too. I will say Microsoft did not help their own case though. Late Thursday night or early Friday morning my time, an Azure region in the US Central region experienced an outage of its own. This was not affiliated and had nothing to do with the CrowdStrike outage. It just unfortunately happened around the same time. And Microsoft made it worse for themselves, in my opinion, by providing a status update on their own regional issue that also flagged the CrowdStrike issue, causing other outages and problems for those using Azure on some of their Azure virtual desktops, Windows 365 cloud PCs, and virtual machines if they had CrowdStrike installed on them. So Microsoft was correct to highlight that CrowdStrike was causing problems for some Azure customers who happened to have CrowdStrike installed on those machines, but I think lumping them together in a status update just added to the confusion. Many techies, and also not so techies, started to take the opportunity to proclaim the death of Microsoft, crying foul of the Windows kernel design and lauding the glory of Linux. I saw someone shared a script on GitHub to help partially automate the recovery and fix, and others commented on the GitHub repository about using Linux and adding absolutely nothing to the conversation. This ignores the fact, by the way, that any OS can crash. Therefore, any operating system can be forced to crash by either nefarious means or by a screw-up like this one. Interestingly, a few months ago, Debian and Rocky Linux machines also got bricked by a Falcon sensor update gone awry. I know Dave Plummer in his video also got into the fact that, Mac OS and Linux machines can also crash. So it's best to maybe not get too fanboyish and cocky about your OS of choice. That's not to say the design of the Windows kernel should be free of criticism though, but I believe Microsoft also sees some of its shortcomings, which I'll talk more about in just a few moments in the conclusion to the story. But rather worryingly for CrowdStrike CEO George Kurtz, this is not the first time he has been at the leadership of a company who has inflicted an outage like this. He happened to be at McAfee back in 2010 when a similar incident occurred, when McAfee delivered a faulty virus definition file to PCs running Windows XP. That file falsely detected a crucial Windows system file, svchost.exe, which is even more crucial now because it spawns so many damn processes in modern versions of the OS. But it detected svchost.exe as a virus and deleted it. The result was that an affected system would enter a reboot loop and lose all network access. So not exactly the same as this incident, but not a million miles apart either. And similar to this incident, that incident required physical manual effort to recover, and it brought several businesses to a halt. There was a conspiracy spreading on social media that this was actually the result of a cyber attack, but pretty quickly, CrowdStrike moved to take ownership of the incident. They also formalized this stance by filing an 8K with the US Securities and Exchange Commission to that effect, basically outlining that they released a sensor configuration update for their Falcon sensor software that resulted in outages for a number of their customers utilizing certain Windows systems. The event was not caused by a cyber attack. They went on to talk about how they moved to remediate the problem, and they did include the fact that this is an evolving situation, and they continue to evaluate the impact of the event on their business and operations. In their forward-looking statements, they mentioned risks and uncertainties, including statements regarding their current understanding of the event and its impacts. They said a number of factors could cause outcomes to differ materially from their statements, including the discovery of new information regarding the event and other risks and uncertainties included in their filings. So a little bit of a CYA there by CrowdStrike. Hopefully that does not mean that they're not disclosing all the information at this time. Hopefully it just is like a legal kind of get out in case they discover like someone didn't follow a certain process, or they just need to figure out if there were any circumstances that they don't fully realize yet. Several outlets reported that Microsoft is trying to blame the European Union for the CrowdStrike incident because of the fact the European regulators ensured security vendors such as CrowdStrike could run in kernel mode. This is just my opinion, and it's a pretty strong opinion, to be honest this time, but I think that's a bunch of BS. Windows Defender leverages kernel mode too. If Microsoft wanted to sell the awesomeness of utilizing APIs rather than running in kernel mode, why not lead the way and show others how it's done with their own product and then allow them to follow suit? The reason why it would have been bad to stop those security vendors from being able to utilize kernel mode was because they would have to stop, while Microsoft would be free to do as they pleased and use the kernel mode for their own products as they see fit. That would give Microsoft a clear competitive advantage over the competition. I understand this incident could have been avoided by removing access to kernel mode from CrowdStrike at that time, but this seems like a poor attempt to shift some of the blame. When editing the podcast this week, I discovered 10 minutes of the audio was unfortunately unusable, so I had to go back and re-record. So I figured I'd add even more content to the CrowdStrike incident. So this is actually some of the latest news as of, Wednesday, I believe it is. CrowdStrike has released an initial post-incident review. in which they stated channel updates are currently deployed globally instantly to all CrowdStrike customers, which certainly explains why it had such a devastating impact so quickly. They said they plan to change this at a later date to operate in waves, so that kind of ring approach. And that's actually something, to be fair to Microsoft, they actually already do with their endpoint security updates. And it was something that got highlighted on social media over the weekend by some of the Microsoft MVPs. They also made a point of prioritizing safety in the future within their incident review, but rather damning of themselves is the fact they claim they tested over 20 times, but none of the channel tests they performed involved actually putting the updates on a CrowdStrike system, which seems crazy. I guess it was just a manual testing process. One of the follow-up actions listed is to test updates on development systems. So really, in essence, they weren't doing proper testing, so no wonder this managed to make it past their QA process. And unfortunately, to rub salt in the wounds of those who lost their weekends to trying to recover or help customers recover, CrowdStrike reportedly sent $10 Uber Eats gift cards to thank its overworked contractors and partners who are helping to manage the fallout. And I should add, I saw some in the UK were getting like £7.50 sterling. So it's not even like a like for like. It's not £10 in the UK and $10 in the US. It's just whatever the equivalent of $10 was in that currency. Unfortunately, Uber actually went on and flagged the gift cards for being potentially fraudulent. So some had the gift cards at least temporarily revoked so they couldn't use them at the time, which actually seems quite fitting of what went on with this entire incident. Talk about rubbing salt in the wounds. So I think when it comes to this particular large-scale outage and responses to it, for IT professionals, really it was an example of maybe some of the good, the bad, and the ugly. Of course, the good was the community was very helpful with information sharing and quickly helping each other, such as sharing the fact that multiple reboots could potentially fix crashing endpoints. I saw the awesome Paul Eden said that he looked into charity organizations in his area to see if any who were being impacted by this may have needed help recovering machines over the weekend, which is awesome. That's part of that good. There were tips for streamlining fixes, such as those that I shared by Jeremy Moskowitz. But unfortunately, there were also many accounts of misinformation and conspiracy theories being spread and getting amplified on Twitter due to its current bizarre structure of how it amplifies content from accounts with blue checks. Also in the bad category, there were reports of cyber gangs leveraging the incident for social engineering purposes and phishing attacks by contacting people who they thought might be affected by the outage and pretending to be a solution or a fix to them, getting them to give certain information. And in my opinion, the ugly has been the many vendors using this as an opportunity to promote their products and offerings as though it's a fix. So I'm fine with vendors addressing the issue and saying, hey, our customers who are affected by this can do this or that. But I didn't really appreciate some of the grandstanding of, hey, if this happens again, we're your solution, we're the fix, or we are the silver bullet that could have helped you in this situation. I don't even know if it's all that bad for them to even do that, but I think doing it within the first 24 or 48 hours when IT teams are struggling to come to grips and working endless hours to try and recover machines, I think doing it then was a bit ugly and classless, and I saw my buddy David O'Brien tweeted and used the term ambulance chasers, which is certainly what it felt like. But maybe to add to the conversation and discourse on Twitter, I saw that John Markham tweeted the question, what is going to change from this? And there were many interesting responses, and I won't claim them as my own or share them on the podcast. I just encourage you to check out the Twitter thread for yourself, and I'll share a link to it with this episode, which is episode 244, and you'll find it at 5bytespodcast.com. But my take is we may go back to the way things were 10 plus years ago, where enterprises would not allow vendors carte blanche access to update applications on their network. I feel like enterprises were never really comfortable allowing it in the first place, but felt it was the lesser of two evils. Would you rather deal with a bad update breaking your systems or a ransomware attack on your network that also exposes customer data that was made possible by you leaving an unpatched, vulnerable product on your desktops and servers, essentially meaning you are liable and at fault for exposing your customer data? I think most believed dealing with a bad update was the best of a bad lot, but I think most don't realize you do not have to choose one or the other. You don't have to make a choice of, well, what's the least bad of those options? You can manage application updates while still maintaining visibility and control. What was also interesting was those that I spoke with who had large VDI with non-persistent desktops fared relatively well in terms of recovery. Their outage tended to be a matter of hours rather than days. Does that mean organizations will move to non-persistent desktops en masse? Maybe not. Personally, I think the crux of the issue is keeping control of the updates. CrowdStrike messed up the update. It was sent across the board when it should have been trickled out and only to those who opted into that early update cadence. But now that this happened, would you trust a vendor to abide by and do incremental updates correctly? I think it would be better to control that yourself. But not only that, if you accept the possibility that system crashes like this can happen, which of course they can, what is your disaster recovery plan? I talked to a buddy who said they just started re-imaging desktops because it was faster than doing the manual recovery and deleting the file. What is your plan if you lose access to your physical Windows desktops? Do you have a plan to maybe quickly provision desktops up in a cloud? And what does that look like for you? If you're using desktops in a cloud, are you able to move from one cloud to the other quickly? I think those are questions that are worth asking. Having a proper disaster recovery plan in place, having the agility to quickly move your users to functioning desktops, and also maintaining visibility and control of updates that are occurring on your network. Like I said, there was much BS about Microsoft and Windows because of this issue, with major shade being thrown at the Windows kernel, and a suggestion there's a need to do away with it. I saw some Microsoft employees getting upset about this on social media, claiming that Microsoft tried to get security vendors to leverage APIs for their products and that they threatened an anti-competition suit against Microsoft. I also saw a former Microsoft employee pointing out what I'd covered on this podcast, the fact that Microsoft has started to move towards Rust in the Windows OS. Regardless of all this discussion and conjecture, a major change to the Windows kernel that most enterprises depend on today is something that could take some time. So we must face the reality of what we have today, and we must adapt to this current reality rather than focusing on the noise. And I believe that is by having proper disaster recovery in place, being able to quickly move users to functioning desktops and building those desktops quickly, having a multi-cloud approach, and maintaining control and visibility of updates on your network. This will go down as the longest single story that I've talked about on the history of this podcast, and it may even be the longest episode. So if you stuck through all that, thank you. Let's get on to some other news. So I'm going to cover this one as a separate story, but I do have my suspicions. Microsoft have published a warning that after installing the July 2024 Windows Security Update released on July 9th, that update specifically being KB 5040442, you may actually see a Bitlocker recovery screen upon booting your device. Sounds familiar? This screen does not commonly appear after a Windows update, they say, but it has appeared after previous updates in the past as well. So yeah, it's not common, it's not every month, but it has happened before with Windows updates. You are more likely to face this issue if you have the device encryption option enabled in settings under Privacy and Security Device Encryption, which I saw others pointing out is very, very interesting wording because it doesn't necessarily say BitLocker, it just says device encryption. So some may have enabled device encryption on their devices, not realizing it's BitLocker, which, of course it's going to be because that's Microsoft's product. Resulting from this issue, you may be prompted to enter the recovery key from your Microsoft account to unlock the drive, but there is a workaround. Your device should proceed to start up normally from the BitLocker recovery screen once the recovery key has been entered. And Microsoft suggests a workaround of simply entering the recovery key, which, as I just covered in the previous story, is a pain in the butt because it's a really long recovery key. I think it might be like 48 digits. I can't remember exactly, but I remember it being a pain in the butt. I saw someone on the patch management mail group pointed out, well, since last weekend, we now know how to bypass this recovery key prompt. So I guess that's one silver lining from the incident. On last week's episode of the podcast, I covered the story that Google was looking to acquire Wiz, which is a cybersecurity company, but apparently the deal is now dead. CNBC reports Wiz may now look at floating on the stock exchange instead. Last week was a little different to usual as I started scripting the podcast days earlier than I normally would. So when I was recording, I was sure to add the fact that the deal had not been closed at that time, because when I had started scripting it, it was being bandied about that this was going to happen. But by the time it was being uploaded, there was still no word that it would actually closed, which is a bit odd because usually when a story like this breaks, the deal is closed within a matter of days, but that did not happen. And I thought that was odd. So I didn't say that it was closed. I actually made a point that it wasn't closed, and it appears this is why it took so long, because a deal could not be reached, which I will say, I'm not sure what the ins and outs of this were, why they walked away from the deal, but it seems pretty bold and brave by Wiz, and I wish them luck with their IPO. According to the Register, Gartner has nudged down its expected growth in worldwide IT spending for 2024, going from 8% to 7.5%. So still significant growth, with the total figure now expected to reach $5.26 trillion. They stated data center spending is responsible for much of the growth, with the suggestion investment in AI may contribute, but this was, of course, before the major outage that occurred over the weekend. So I think maybe some of the budget may be spent on other matters too, of shoring up disaster recovery planning, but I guess we'll wait and see. The NHS in the UK has said they will use AI to streamline certain aspects of their business operations. AI software will be used to prepare X-ray reports and read blood test results, and potentially lead to rapid assessments in emergency departments, more home-based treatments, and virtual wards. Jonathan Lofthouse, who's the Group Chief Executive of NHS Humber Health Partnership, said the transformative project would create meaningful and lasting change. The virtual wards would end time-consuming outpatient appointments and prevent emergency and unnecessary admissions to hospital, while the use of specialist AI software would help doctors to provide more hands-on patient care. The BBC reports that patient packs would be issued within 24 hours of arrival at hospital, outlining expected treatment such as scans, tests, or surgery, and estimated dates of discharge. Elsewhere, enhanced rounds would review every patient daily before 10 a.m. to check treatment is on track and discharge dates are appropriate. So this sounds really cool, but as I will cover in a later story, this may not be the only story of the week where there's been these big headline announcements of how AI is going to revolutionize a business and get you all hyped up and excited. But what's going to matter is how it's actually implemented. So we're going to have to wait and see what the actual end result of this all is. Cisco disclosed a vulnerability in Cisco Async OS within their security email gateway appliances. The vulnerability is listed as C 2024-20401, and it is an arbitrary file write security flaw in the SEG content scanning and message filtering features, and is caused by an absolute path traversal weakness that allows replacing any file on the underlying operating system. Attackers can add new users with root privileges and permanently crash SEG appliances using emails with malicious attachments. To see if you're affected by this, if you're using these appliances, go to Mail Policies, Incoming Mail Policies, Advanced Malware Protection, Mail Policy, and check to see if the Enable File Analysis is checked. This impacts SEG appliances if they're running a vulnerable Cisco Async OS, and they have the file analysis feature enabled, as I just mentioned, and the content scanner tools version is earlier than version 23.3.0.4823. The fix for this vulnerability is delivered to affected devices with the Content Scanner Tools package, versions 23.3.0.4823 and later, and the updated version is included by default in Cisco Async OS for Cisco Secure Email Software releases 15.5.1-055 and later. BleepyComputer.com reports that Google has scrapped its plans to kill third-party cookies in Chrome and will instead introduce a new browser experience that allows users to limit how these cookies are used. If you listen to this podcast regularly, you may have heard me cover their privacy sandbox feature that they were launching, which I had speculated at the time was potentially actually a way for advertisers to actually get access to data that they've been able to get to in some cases when users disallow cookies. Google now says that since the transition requires significant work and will impact publishers, advertisers, and any other company involved in online advertising when trying to get to the privacy sandbox feature, they are no longer phasing out third-party cookies because I guess it's too much of an upheaval. I guess we'll have to wait and see if they eventually try to turn the screw and get people over to the new feature. When researching the recent regression vulnerability that I covered previously on the podcast, a researcher by the name of Alexander Pelsak discovered another vulnerability. This one tracked as CVE-2024-6409, which he described as a race condition in signal handling involving the PrivSep child process. He said it's similar to the regression vulnerability, but the main difference from CVE-2024-6387 is that the race condition and remote code execution potential are triggered in the PrivSep child process, which runs with reduced privileges compared to the parent server process, so the immediate impact is lower. However, there may be differences in exploitability of these vulnerabilities in a particular scenario, which could make either one of these a more attractive choice for an attacker. And if only one of these is fixed or mitigated, then the other one becomes more relevant. It may also be possible to construct an exploit that would work against either vulnerability, which could decrease attack duration or increase attack success. At the moment, there has been no actual exploitation of this new vulnerability, but obviously it's a good idea to patch nonetheless, and impacted Linux distributions have started releasing advisories and patches for this latest vulnerability. It's official, 2023 was the first year that data centers in Ireland surpassed the electricity used by homes in its towns and cities, which consumed 18% of the grid's total power last year. Professor Paul Dean, who's a senior research fellow at the University College Cork, told the Irish Examiner, quote, "If we already had lots of wind and lots of solar, it wouldn't be a problem. We're still so reliant on fossil fuels, we need to be able to build up renewables very quickly. We're good at building large data centers quickly, but not as good at building renewables." Ireland relied on fossil fuels for more than 50% of its electricity last year, of which 45% was generated by gas plants and the remainder from burning coal, peat, or oil. Wind power made up 34.6% of Ireland's electricity, while solar contributed 1.2%. End quote. So it's not a surprise that solar only contributed 1.2% because it's Ireland. Our weather is terrible. But obviously, the fact that we are completely unprotected against the elements, especially on the west coast of Ireland where I live, for that facing into the Atlantic with nothing obstructing us, we get a whole lot of wind. So 34.6% of the electricity being made up by wind already is a pretty good start, but we can definitely improve on that. And I know that there's a plan to install, I think, is 1,100 wind turbines out to sea off the west coast of Ireland. So hopefully that will lead to better results in terms of our electricity generation. I don't know, also, there's a project or an agreement for building an interconnector between Ireland and France where France generates a lot of their power by nuclear stations. That's a kind of infrastructure Ireland's never going to have, I think. So we would be able to get some of their nuclear generated power, and in turn, when we have all these wind turbines and hopefully we're generating an excess amount of power, we'll be able to contribute some of our wind created energy back to France. So we definitely need to improve on the speed of turning this around, but I'm hopeful that we at least get there. Earlier this week, Omnissa did a kind of big announcement event. I will say the video quality itself was pretty impressive. Like the production qualities were cool. They had a nice little stage setup. It did look like a pretty professional and polished announcement. They had a video of a side-by-side chat kind of discussion and interview, spliced in with what looked like an actual like live announcement, kind of like an Apple type of event. Unfortunately, if you're trying to watch it live, which I was and many others were, well, not many others, I think it was about 1,700, the stream did not perform well. So it was streaming on LinkedIn and it kept buffering every few seconds. And I saw people saying that their video would just completely drop out and stop and they'd have to refresh. So, in that regard, it wasn't a great occasion, unfortunately. Probably even worse, as Gabe Knuth had pointed out in his review on his LinkedIn profile. The announcement included a lot of buzzwords and hyperbole, but no actual product demos or even really any technical product details. I also saw some comments in the live stream asking for clarification on the licensing agreements and those who are using Horizon today or Workspace ONE and their license impact for the vSphere suite going forward. So it seems like people still do not have clarity on that since the VMware EUC was divested. Now, I will say that the blog post around this announcement did say that they'd be releasing more details in the coming weeks. And I did reach out to Omnissa via Twitter or X and ask them if they have any like teaser video or something at least to show what they're talking about in this announcement. But they said just on the YouTube channel and keep viewing over the next few weeks. What they were talking about at a high level is basically modernizing the workspace and leveraging AI like natural language processing, generative AI, and pretty much every AI buzz term to create a smart workspace. But without actually seeing the demo or them actually explaining the nitty gritty details of what you can do with it, it was really just big claims with no substance, unfortunately. Hopefully, they release videos over the next few weeks. I'll keep an eye out and I'll share details with everyone on the podcast if they do. But unfortunately, yeah, the event was pretty disappointing and frankly a bit of a waste of time for me. To wrap up the news for this week, I'd just like to say a quick congratulations to Raspberry Pi, who manufactured their 50 millionth device this month. So I've had a couple of them myself, and I know they're very popular in the community. So yeah, just a big congratulations to Raspberry Pi. And now, this episode's scripts, tricks, and tips. I'm going to try and quickly get through the scripts, tricks, and tips because this may turn out to be the longest episode that I've ever done. But first up, codeproject.com shared a PowerShell form generator. So if you work with PowerShell and you have the need for a UI and required to take input from a form, this may be for you. I also saw that my buddy Dave Brett shared a sneak preview of upcoming features for the EUC Profile Buddy server that he created. It includes role-based access control, a central administration console, and the ability to centrally execute help desk tasks to endpoints. So this looks really exciting, and I suggest that you follow Dave on Twitter, that's dbretty, to stay in the loop for when these features are available. And finally, Guy Leach shared a tip for those who want to get the contents of a file in a PowerShell prompt, such as an SSH config. But there are maybe too many blank lines and comments, making it difficult to see the actual lines. Now, I must warn those who are a little uneasy and queasy when it comes to regex that it involves regex, and I'm not going to call it out because just even when it's a regular PowerShell commandlet, it's difficult for audio-only listeners to listen to me call out a long commandlet in multiple parameters. And when it's regex, I might as well be speaking a different language. But if you'd like to check it out for yourself, you can either check out the YouTube edition of this episode, which again is episode 344, and you can find that at 5bytespodcast.com, or I'll share a link to it as I do everything that I talk about on every episode of the podcast, and you'll find that over at 5bytespodcast.com with this episode. Well, If you stuck through this entire episode, kudos to you. This is much longer than a usual episode. I hope you enjoyed it, and hopefully we're back to business as usual next week. Thank you for listening.